Virgin Obese was auctioned for $2, until a giant mountain man came and said, "You are coming with me." In the unforgiving frontier of 1870s America, where a woman's worth was measured in dowries and bloodlines, some souls were deemed worthless before they drew their first breath. The auction block was the final judgment, a place where hope went to die and human dignity was sold to the highest bidder. But sometimes in the darkest moments, salvation arrives in the most unexpected form. This is the story of Rosalie, a young woman society cast aside, and Magnus, the mountain giant who saw treasure where others saw trash. It's a tale of two outcasts who discovered that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the smallest price tag and that true worth can never be bought or sold. Buckle up for a journey into the heart of the American wilderness, where Judgment Day comes not from society's cruel scales, but from the raw, honest earth itself, where a $2 purchase becomes priceless, and where the unwanted find their kingdom in the clouds. The sun was a merciless judge over Bitter Ridge, its glare turning the auction platform into a stage of damnation. Dust motes danced like tiny demons in the suffocating air, and the crowd pressed closer, their eyes hungry for the spectacle of human degradation. Rosalie stood on the splintered wooden block, her dress once white, now the color of defeat, clinging to her trembling frame. The fabric hung loose on shoulders that had learned to curve inward, as if trying to make herself smaller, invisible, less of a burden to a world that had never wanted her. The auctioneer's voice cut through the morning heat like a rusty blade. "What am I bid for this specimen?" His pause was deliberate, cruel. Strong enough for field work, good birthing hips. The last comment drew snickers from the assembled men. Rosalie's cheeks burned, but she kept her gaze fixed on the distant mountains that rose like sleeping giants. Silence stretched like a noose around her neck. A man in the front row belly, straining against a stained vest, spat tobacco juice near her feet. "She'd eat more than she's worth," he drawled. The crowd erupted in laughter that felt like physical blows. $50! The auctioneer tried, his voice cracking with false enthusiasm. A fine woman for any homestead, nothing but the buzz of flies and distant sounds of the living town that wanted no part of her. 30. A collective shake of heads, some accompanied by dramatic grimaces. 20. More silence, thick as molasses, sweet as poison. Rosalie's fingers dug into her palms until she felt the sharp sting of her nails breaking skin. The pain was clean, honest, unlike the festering wound of being unwanted that had poisoned her soul for 23 years. Breathe. The word became a prayer, a desperate attempt to hold on to something real, while the world reduced her to numbers that kept falling like autumn leaves. $10. She closed her eyes, trying to disappear into darkness. But she could still hear them, the whispers that cut deeper than knives, the casual cruelty of people who had never known the particular shame of being unwanted from birth. 5. Someone shouted, "Too much," and the laughter was sharp enough to draw blood. $2. The auctioneer's voice reached desperation. Surely someone needs harvest help. The gavel rose like a guillotine blade. Going once. Rosalie opened her eyes, staring at the horizon where mountains stood as eternal guardians. Soon she would be cast out, completely left to wander those peaks until cold or hunger claimed her. Going twice. The crowd held its breath, savoring her destruction. Some leaned forward, eager to witness the exact moment when a human soul was declared worthless. But then the crowd stirred. A murmur rippled through the assembled vultures' heads, turning toward shadows gathering at the square's edge like storm clouds. Something was coming. Something that made grown men step back and mothers pull children close. The footsteps were deliberate, heavy as thunder, shaking the earth with each measured stride. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, revealing a figure that belonged more to legend than reality. Magnus. 7 feet of mountain-forged muscle and bone shoulders, broad enough to carry the world's weight. His hair, dark as winter storms, hung wild past his collar. His face was carved from granite-sharp angles and weathered planes that spoke of years staring into wind and snow and endless sky. But his eyes made the bravest men look away. Pale blue as glacial ice, they held the cold wisdom of high places and the patient fury of avalanches waiting to fall. He moved through the crowd with the inevitability of natural disaster, each step deliberate and inexorable. His buckskin coat stretched across his massive frame, decorated with bone toggles that caught light like tiny skulls. Silent, unstoppable, terrifying in the way forces of nature are terrifying. "Sweet Jesus," someone whispered, "it's the giant. Thought he was dead." "Wish he was." Magnus paid them no mind. His gaze was fixed on the platform on the trembling woman who stood like a broken bird trying to remember flight. The auctioneer's hand shook. Sir, if you're looking for supplies, $2! Magnus's voice was boulders grinding together, low and inexorable. "Sir, you heard me." He reached into his coat and produced 2 silver coins, letting them fall onto the platform where they rang like church bells announcing salvation or doom. The crowd held its breath. Rosalie stared at this mountain of a man who had just purchased her. His eyes met hers, and she saw something that made her heart stumble, not cruelty or hunger, but a deep, ancient sadness that matched her own. "You're coming with me," he said simply. The journey into the wilderness was a passage between worlds, a slow transformation from the realm of human judgment to the honest democracy of stone and sky. Behind them, civilization's smoke and noise faded like a fever dream. The dusty streets of Bitter Ridge, the cruel laughter, the weight of measuring eyes all dissolved until it seemed like something from another lifetime. Ahead, mountains rose like ancient gods awakening their peaks crowned with eternal snow. Pine armies marched up slopes toward heights where only eagles ventured. The air grew different, thinner, cleaner, sharp, with snow scent and possibility. Magnus spoke little during the ride. Drink. Rest. Careful here. But Rosalie felt how carefully he guided the massive black horse around rough patches, ensuring she wasn't jostled. She noticed how he shared his water without being asked, how he produced jerky from his pack. Not tough leather, but meat prepared with care and seasoned with mountain herbs. Small kindnesses, foreign concepts after years of cruelty disguised as charity. The trail narrowed as they climbed, winding through cathedral groves of ancient pines. Streams bubbled over stones worn smooth by centuries of persistence, their voices a liquid music that spoke of time measured in seasons rather than minutes. "Not much further," Magnus said as sunset painted the peaks gold and crimson. They crested a final ridge and Rosalie gasped. Spread before them was a hidden valley protected by towering granite walls. A crystal stream meandered through meadows dotted with wildflowers, paintbrush, and lupine that painted the earth in nameless colors. Deer grazed unafraid in evening light. An eagle circled overhead riding thermals with casual mastery, and nestled against the far cliff as if grown from the mountain itself stood a cabin. Not the rough shack she'd expected, but a home built with knowledge and patience. Solid timber walls, windows catching light like welcoming eyes, smoke curling from a stone chimney. A garden showed careful rows and wooden stakes with precise notations. Split wood was stacked with mathematical precision. "This is yours," she asked, her voice rusty from silence. "Ours," he said simply, and something fluttered in her chest like a caged bird testing its wings. He helped her down with gentle care, his massive hands supporting her like spun glass. "You're safe here," he said, leading her toward the door. "No one comes to this place. No one knows its secrets." The interior shattered every assumption she'd built. Hand-hewn furniture built to last centuries. Bookshelves lined one wall, actual books, leather-bound and well-read. Poetry and philosophy, natural history and engineering. This wasn't a simple mountain man's library, but accumulated wisdom of someone who had spent years learning growing. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, large enough to drive back mountain winter's killing cold. Comfortable chairs positioned to catch its warmth. Hand-woven rugs in patient patterns. This wasn't a monster's lair. This was sanctuary built by someone who understood that civilization wasn't about crowds, but about the care you took with your space and what you chose to value. "There's a room for you," Magnus said, indicating a door. "Your own space, a lock on the inside." He turned away, giving her privacy, but she caught his arm. His muscle was like iron beneath her fingers, but he stopped immediately. "Why?" The question scraped her throat. "Why me?" Magnus was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he looked at her with ice-blue eyes that seemed to see her soul. "Because I know what it feels like," he said, "to be something the world doesn't want." As night settled over their mountain sanctuary, Rosalie stood at her window, looking out at peaks silhouetted against stars. For the first time in her life, she felt something she'd never known hope. But she didn't yet understand that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages, or that her journey from worthless to priceless was just beginning. Outside, night sounds whispered of changes coming. Some beautiful, some terrible, all necessary for the transformation that would remake them both. Days flowed into weeks. Like water finding its natural course, each sunrise bringing new lessons in the art of living rather than merely surviving. Rosalie discovered that existence in the high country was its own education, having nothing to do with deportment and domestic art she'd been taught were woman's proper sphere. Magnus became her teacher in this wilderness university, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he showed her how to read weather and cloud formations. Find edible plants among mountain flora track deer, through forests where silence was sacred language. "Feel the earth speak," he said one morning as they knelt beside fresh prints in soft soil. "Every step tells a story." His hands covered hers, guiding her fingers along tracks. "This doe favors her left forefoot. See how the impression is lighter. She's injured, but not crippled. She'll seek water and shelter, not speed." Rosalie found herself leaning into his instruction, hungry for knowledge that mattered. This was real learning, reading wind patterns that warned of storms preserving meat, against lean months starting fire with flint, when matches meant life or death. "You're a natural," Magnus said as she successfully snared her first rabbit. His praise was delivered casually, but she caught the approval in his glacier-eye satisfaction of a teacher watching understanding dawn. The compliment warmed her more than any flattery about appearance ever had. This was recognition of competence, of growth, of becoming something more. But evenings revealed the man beneath the mountain. As firelight danced across cabin walls, Magnus would read aloud from his library Shakespeare's sonnets in a voice that transformed their home into Globe Theatre Whitman's celebrations, that seemed perfect for their mountain sanctuary. Thoreau's meditations on simplicity that gained new meaning from a man who'd chosen wilderness over civilization's compromises. "I celebrate myself and sing myself," he read one night, his granite voice giving Whitman's words prophetic weight. "And what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you." "Do you believe that?" Rosalie asked softly. "That we're all worthy of celebration?" Magnus closed the book finger marking the page with careful attention. "I believe worth isn't measured by the world's scales. Auction blocks, bank accounts, approval of people who've never known hunger, those aren't measures that matter." She was changing. She felt it in muscles, growing strong from mountain work hands, calloused from honest labor mind, expanding to hold new knowledge like a vessel filled with light. But the most profound change was in her heart. She caught herself watching Magnus work, how he tended his garden with hands that could crush, but instead coaxed seedlings toward sun, his gentle manner with wild creatures that visited as if drawn by invisible promises of safety. She saw how he carved small figures during quiet evenings, massive hands creating delicate art he left scattered like gifts to invisible spirits. This wasn't the monster Bitter Ridge whispered about. This was a man hurt by the world who'd chosen kindness anyway, rejected by civilization, but responding by creating his own version, one built on better principles that measured worth in growth and courage to be oneself. One morning she found a wooden carving on her windowsill, a small bird with wings spread wide caught between earth and sky. "It's beautiful," she told him over breakfast. "It's you," he said simply, not looking up. "Learning to fly." That night she studied herself in the small mirror, amazed at the transformation. The soft, pale girl from the auction block was gone. In her place stood a woman with sun-bronzed skin, bright eyes, holding confidence of someone who'd learned she could survive anything calloused hands, valuable for what they could accomplish. She was becoming something new, something the world had never allowed her to be, something worth far more than 2 silver coins. But outside their sanctuary, storm clouds were gathering. The civilized world had noticed their absence, and questions were being asked in town squares and church meetings about the girl who'd vanished and the giant who'd taken her. Soon, their mountain paradise would face its greatest test. The first sign of trouble was silence, not the peaceful quiet that usually blessed their valley, but the unnatural hush that fell when predators moved through territory where they didn't belong. Magnus noticed immediately absent birdsong that should greet dawn's stillness of wind, that should whisper through pines the wrong kind of quiet that spoke of danger approaching on the morning breeze. He set down his axe and tilted his head, listening to sounds only mountain-born ears could interpret. "Riders," he said quietly, "coming up the North Trail. 7, maybe 8. Rosalie felt ice crystallize in her stomach. "From town. Has to be." His voice remained calm, but tension gathered in his shoulders like a storm building. "No one else knows the way." The unspoken question hung between them. What do they want? But they both knew. The civilized world had come to reclaim what it had discarded. "Go inside," Magnus said, moving toward the cabin. "Bar the door." "No." The word surprised them both with its firmness. "This is my home, too. I won't hide while others decide my fate." Magnus studied her face, seeing steel that months of mountain life had forged in her spine. Slowly, he nodded. They came like righteous fury down the mountainside, Preacher Morrison leading the charge, black coat flapping like crow wings. Behind him rode Sheriff Taylor, Deputy Barnes, and 4 men from the auction crowd, their horses laboring on steep trails. "Magnus Ironwood," Morrison's voice echoed off valley walls. "We've come for the girl." Magnus stepped out, Rosalie beside him. His presence filled the clearing, making the horses dance nervously. "There's no girl here," Magnus said evenly. "Only a woman who chose her path." "Chose?" Morrison's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "You kidnapped her, corrupted her. Look at her. She's become as wild as you." Sheriff Taylor's hand rested on his gun. The town council voted. "She returns for proper Christian guidance. You're under arrest for abduction." "I was sold," Rosalie said, her voice carrying clearly. "Like livestock, for $2. I came willingly and stayed because I found something worth more than your approval." "Deceived by this beast," Morrison spat. "Seduced by ungodly promises. We're here to save your soul." Deputy Barnes nudged his horse forward. "Enough talk. You're both coming with us." "No." The word fell like a boulder into still water. Magnus hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, but something in that syllable made horses shy and men reach for weapons. "This woman owes you nothing." Magnus continued, voice gaining strength like approaching avalanche. "She was unwanted cargo you were eager to dispose of." Now you come to reclaim what you discarded. Why?" Rosalie saw the answer in their faces, Morrison's hungry eyes, Barnes licking his lips. They hadn't come to save her. A woman transformed was dangerous a threat to the order that kept them in power. "She belongs to God's work," Morrison said, mask slipping. "The church purchased her debt. She belongs to the Lord's service." "Whose God?" Magnus asked softly. "The one who teaches love? Or the one you've crafted in your image, small and cruel and afraid?" Morrison's face flushed crimson. "Blasphemy, Sheriff, arrest them both." As the men spurred horses forward, weapons drawn, Magnus smiled a terrible expression on granite features. "You forget," he said with quiet certainty of avalanches and earthquakes, "whose mountain you're on." The reckoning had come to their sanctuary, but Magnus and Rosalie would not face it as victim and rescuer. They would meet it as equals, as partners, as two souls who had found their worth in each other, and would not surrender it to any earthly authority. The mountain itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whose will would prove stronger. Civilization's purchased righteousness, or the wild justice of those who had been cast out and found themselves unbreakable. What happened next would be spoken of in whispers for generations in Bitter Ridge, a story that grew with each telling until it became the kind of legend parents used to explain why some mountains should be left alone. Magnus didn't fight like a man bound by civilization's rules. He fought like a force of nature, inevitable, implacable, unstoppable, as the avalanches that reshaped the high country according to laws older than any legal code. When Sheriff Taylor drew his gun, Magnus was already moving, covering the distance in 3 massive strides. His hand closed around Taylor's wrist like granite applying pressure with geological patience. The gun tumbled into meadow grass as Taylor screamed not a warrior's cry, but the shriek of a man discovering his authority meant nothing against genuine danger. But Rosalie fought too, and her transformation was perhaps more shocking than Magnus's controlled violence. The soft girl from the auction block was gone. In her place stood a mountain woman who knew every stone and secret path in this valley. When Deputy Barnes tried flanking Magnus through the stream, she was there with a pine branch striking with precision earned from understanding leverage and vulnerable points where bone met cartilage. "The horses," she called to Magnus. "Drive them toward the Narrows." Together, they turned mounted attack into chaos. Magnus's roar echoed off valley walls, a sound of avalanches and ancient fury. The horses, already nervous in this high place, panicked and bolted with mindless terror, remembering they were prey. 3 riders found themselves afoot, mounts fleeing down treacherous paths, leaving them stranded in hostile territory with no knowledge of mountain survival. Preacher Morrison, still mounted, wheeled his horse and pointed a shaking finger at them. "You'll burn for this. The whole territory will hunt you." "Let them come," Rosalie said, stepping beside Magnus with calm certainty. "Let them see what happens when the unwanted find their worth." Sheriff Taylor struggled to his feet, face mottled with rage. "This isn't over, Giant. The law sold her for $2. Magnus interrupted quietly, more dangerous than his roar. "Your law, your justice, your civilization." He gestured to the valley. "This is higher law, mountain law. The only judgment here is what a soul chooses to become." One by one, the defeated men gathered themselves for the long, shameful journey down. But Morrison turned back once more. "You think you've won. You're still freaks, still outcasts, still worth nothing." Rosalie felt Magnus tense, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You're wrong," she called after the preacher. "We're worth everything to each other, and that's the only worth that matters." As the last attacker disappeared down the trail, Magnus turned to look at her, really look at her, the woman who had stood beside him in battle, who had chosen his wild mountain over their civilized valley, who had bloomed like a wildflower in soil where nothing was supposed to grow. "You could still go back," he said softly. "Find a different life. A normal life. Rosalie smiled, and in that smile was the answer to every question about worth belonging and love. "This is my life," she said. "You are my life." And 2 silver coins bought them the greatest treasure they'll never know they lost. As sunset painted the valley gold and crimson, Magnus took her calloused hand in his massive one. Together they walked back to their cabin, their sanctuary, their kingdom in the clouds. The unwanted had found their worth. The discarded had discovered their treasure. And in a hidden valley where eagles soared and wildflowers danced, 2 outcasts ruled a realm built on the only currency that truly mattered: love freely given and gratefully received. The mountain had rendered its verdict, and justice had been served not by courts or churches, but by the simple truth that worth cannot be auctioned, only recognized by those wise enough to see it. 6 months later, as winter's first snow dusted the peaks like powdered diamonds, their valley had become something beyond sanctuary. It had become home in the deepest sense of the word. Rosalie stood at their cabin window watching Magnus split wood in the morning light. His movements were fluid poetry, each stroke of the axe deliberate and sure. The massive man who had terrified an entire town was gentle with their world, careful with every tool, every animal, every growing thing that had found refuge in their hidden paradise. She was no longer the trembling girl who had stood on the auction block. Months of mountain living had transformed her into something the civilized world wouldn't recognize: a woman with calloused hands that could birth a calf, aim a rifle, or tend wounds with equal skill. Her hair, once carefully pinned and proper, now hung in a thick braid down her back, streaked with early silver that caught sunlight like spun metal. "Storm coming," Magnus said as he entered carrying an armload of wood. His weather sense was never wrong, a gift earned through years of reading the mountain's moods. "How long?" she asked, adding herbs to the stew that simmered over their fire. 3 days, maybe 4. Big one." He set the wood by the hearth and pulled her into his arms, a gesture that still amazed her with its tenderness. This man who could snap trees with his bare hands held her like precious crystal. "We're ready," she said, leaning into his warmth. And they were. Their root cellar was stocked with preserved meat and vegetables. Their wood pile could outlast the worst winter. They had books to read, projects to complete, and each other's company to make the long white months feel like gifts rather than trials. The storm, when it came, was magnificent in its fury. Wind howled through the peaks like a living thing, and snow fell so thick it erased the world beyond their windows. But inside their cabin, warmth and light and love made a bubble of paradise in the wilderness. Magnus worked on a cradle he was carving, not because Rosalie was with child yet, but because hope demanded preparation. She stitched quilts and mended clothes, her needle flying with the skill born of necessity and the satisfaction of creating beautiful, useful things. "Read to me," she would say during the long evenings, and Magnus would choose from their library, sometimes poetry that made her cry with its beauty, sometimes philosophy that sparked debates lasting till dawn, sometimes simple adventure stories that let them escape to other worlds while remaining perfectly content in their own. On the storm's 3rd night, as wind reached a howling crescendo, they heard something impossible: hoofbeats in the snow, the sound of someone fighting through the blizzard toward their door. Magnus was on his feet immediately, rifle in hand, but Rosalie caught his arm. "Wait," she said, listening to something in the rhythm of those desperate hoofbeats. "That's not an attack. That's someone dying." They opened the door to find a horse collapsing in their yard, its rider, a young woman barely alive, frozen, nearly solid, tumbling into the snow. Together, they carried her inside this stranger who had somehow found their hidden valley in the worst storm in years. As they warmed her by the fire, stripping away frozen clothes and wrapping her in furs, the woman whispered through chattering teeth, "Saw your light in the storm. Heard there was sanctuary. Here. You heard right. Rosalie said, spooning warm broth between the stranger's lips. "You're safe now." Over the following days, as the storm passed and the woman Sarah, escaping an arranged marriage to a brutal man, recovered her strength, they learned that their story had spread beyond Bitter Ridge. Whispered tales of the giant and his lady, of a place in the mountains where the unwanted could find worth, where love conquered judgment. "Others will come," Sarah said as she prepared to leave, healthy now and bound for California, where a sister waited. "People like us who don't fit the world's narrow spaces." Magnus and Rosalie exchanged glances, understanding passing between them without words. Their sanctuary could become something larger, not just a refuge for two, but a beacon for all who had been cast aside by a world too small for their dreams. "Let them come," Rosalie said, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had learned her own worth. "We have room for hearts brave enough to climb this high." As spring returned to their valley, bringing wildflowers and new life, Magnus took Rosalie's hand as they stood on their porch, watching the sun paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. "Any regrets?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. "Only one," she said, smiling at his surprise, "that it took the world so long to show me I was worth more than 2 silver coins." Below them, their valley spread like a promise, a kingdom built not on money or power, but on the radical notion that every soul has worth, that love sees treasure where the world sees trash, and that sometimes the greatest riches are found in the places civilization fears to tread. They had been the unwanted, the discarded, the worthless. But in finding each other, they had found everything that truly mattered. And their mountain kingdom stood ready to welcome all who sought the same miraculous transformation, from worthless to priceless, from outcast to royalty, from alone to beloved. If this story of love conquering judgment touched your heart, please like and subscribe for more tales of the discarded finding their worth and the broken discovering their strength. In a world that too often measures value in coins, these stories remind us that the greatest treasures are found in the human heart.